The sentence. The courtyard's clamor subsided as Pilate, his face a mask of weary resignation, entered the relative quiet of his audience chamber. The transition was jarring, a stark shift from the howling tempest outside to the hushed formality within. The heavy oak doors, usually symbols of Roman power, seemed to groan under the weight of the decision about to be made. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight piercing the gloom, each mote a tiny, insignificant witness to the unfolding tragedy. Jesus stood before him, a figure of quiet dignity amidst the oppressive grandeur of the Roman setting. His face, etched with weariness, bore no trace of anger or defiance, only a profound sadness, a quiet acceptance of his fate. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. His silence was a more powerful accusation than any shouted protest. It was a condemnation of the very system that had brought him here. Pilate, his gaze flickering between Jesus and the empty judgment seat, felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him. He was not merely judging a man. He was wrestling with the very essence of justice, with the crushing weight of empire, with the unyielding tide of religious fanaticism. His earlier hopes of a compromise, of finding a way to appease both the crowd and his conscience, were now shattered remnants of a naive idealism. He looked at the assembled witnesses, the scowling faces of the Pharisees and Sadducees, their righteous indignation barely concealed behind their carefully cultivated air of piety. They were vultures, circling their prey, waiting for the final, satisfying stroke. Their silence, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of robes, was more menacing than any shouted accusation. They had achieved their goal. The condemnation of Jesus was a foregone conclusion. Pilate cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the cavernous chamber. His voice, usually resonant with the authority of Roman power, was thin and reedy, betraying the turmoil within. The evidence, the accusations, they are substantial. He struggled to find the words, each syllable a heavy burden. The phrasing was careful, a calculated attempt to soften the inevitable blow, to distance himself from the moral bankruptcy of the decision. But even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow, a pathetic attempt to justify the unjustifiable. He paused, allowing the silence to hang heavy in the air, a suffocating blanket of expectation. He looked again at Jesus, searching for some sign of defiance, some hint of anger, anything to give him a reason, a justification, for defying the howling mob outside. But there was nothing, only that same quiet, heartbreaking acceptance. I find no sufficient evidence of sedition or rebellion against Rome. Pilate continued, his words halting, each one a struggle. He knew it was a lie, a desperate attempt to salvage his own conscience while sacrificing another's innocence. He had sought, however briefly, a sliver of truth in the chaos, a pathway through the moral morass. However, the reality of his position had crushed that hope. The Pharisees stirred, their murmuring a rising tide of protest. One, bolder than the rest, stepped forward, his voice dripping with venomous piety. But he claims to be the king of the Jews. He incites rebellion against Caesar. He is a threat to our faith, our laws, our very way of life. His words were a carefully crafted tapestry of religious zeal and political maneuvering, designed to turn even Pilate's wavering resolve into unwavering condemnation. Pilate knew they were manipulating him. He knew the truth was far more nuanced, far more complex than their simplistic accusations allowed. Yet, the weight of the crowd's fury, the ever-present threat of violence, loomed over him, stifling his ability to make a just decision. He had underestimated the power of mob mentality, the ability of a skillfully manipulated crowd to dictate the course of justice. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the gesture betraying the internal war raging within him. He saw his own reflection in the polished surface of the judgment seat, a haunted, weary image staring back at him. The Roman governor, the symbol of imperial power, felt utterly powerless, trapped between his conscience and the implacable force of the mob. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world, Pilate spoke again. "Very well, he conceded, his voice barely a whisper. "But I wash my hands of this matter. His blood be on your heads." The words were ritualistic, a desperate attempt to absolve himself of the moral responsibility for the injustice he was about to perpetrate. The gesture, the symbolic washing of hands, was as empty and futile as his words. It could not erase the stain of his complicity. The Pharisees murmured their approval, a low hum of satisfaction that filled the chamber like a poisonous gas. They had won. Their manipulation had succeeded. The tide of their religious zeal had crushed reason and justice beneath its relentless weight. Pilate's official pronouncement was brief, stark, and utterly devoid of compassion. Jesus was condemned, not for any crime against Rome, but for the unforgivable sin of being different, of challenging the established order, of speaking truth to power. The sentence was delivered not with the impartial gravity of Roman law, but with the craven expediency of a man desperate to survive. The formal pronouncement, delivered in Latin, felt more like a death knell echoing through the chamber. It resonated with the weight of countless other judgments, each one a testament to the fragility of justice in the face of power and prejudice. The decision, sealed with the official seal of Roman authority, held not the promise of fairness or righteousness, but the stark, brutal finality of death. The stillness that followed was even more oppressive than the clamor outside. The air crackled with a silent, unspoken understanding. The fate of Jesus had been sealed, not by the weight of evidence or the scales of justice, but by the unrelenting power of fear, religious fanaticism, and ruthless political expediency. The darkness that had begun to envelop Pilate in the courtyard now filled the official chamber, a pervasive shadow of doubt and regret that would cling to him for the rest of his days. The trial had ended. The condemnation had been pronounced. The shadow of the cross fell long and dark, reaching not only to Jesus but to every person present, and to the countless others who would learn of this day. The road to Calvary. The heavy wooden door of the praetorium swung shut behind them, the sound swallowed by the cacophony of Jerusalem. The air, thick with the dust of the city and the tension of the moment, pressed down on Jesus like a physical weight. He felt the rough texture of the coarse linen tunic chafing against his skin, a minor discomfort dwarfed by the immensity of what lay ahead. The condemned man, stripped of his dignity, yet somehow more regal than any king, began the slow, agonizing journey to Golgotha. Simon of Cyrene, a stranger pressed into service, bore the crossbeam, a cruel burden that mirrored the weight of the world's sins Jesus carried within him. The wood, rough and splintered, dug into his shoulders, a constant, agonizing reminder of the injustice inflicted. Jesus, weakened by scourging, stumbled alongside, his steps faltering, his breath ragged, each breath a struggle. The rhythmic thud of his bare feet against the uneven cobblestones was a counterpoint to the rising crescendo of the jeers and taunts from the throng. The route to Calvary wound through the narrow, twisting streets of Jerusalem, a labyrinth of shadows and sunlight. The city, usually vibrant and bustling with life, felt oppressive, suffocating. The air thick with hatred and anticipation. The crowds pressed in, a surging, tumultuous sea of faces, some filled with morbid curiosity, others with feverish religious zeal, and still others with a cold, calculating satisfaction. Their words were like stones thrown at his already wounded body, each insult a fresh wound on a soul already bleeding. "Crucify him!" they screamed, the refrain echoing through the labyrinthine streets, a venomous chant that rose and fell like a monstrous wave. Their voices, a chorus of hatred, pierced the silence of Jesus' inner resolve. He felt the sting of their contempt, the weight of their accusations, yet his gaze remained fixed on the path ahead, his heart focused on the immensity of his purpose, on the sacrifice he was about to make for humanity. His disciples, a small, beleaguered band, stumbled along behind, their faces etched with grief and despair. Their steps were heavy with sorrow, their hearts burdened with the knowledge of what was to come. John, ever loyal, walked beside him, his hand gently gripping Jesus' arm for support. The touch was a balm to his wounded spirit, a subtle reminder that he was not utterly alone. The other disciples, their faces stained with tears, followed, their faith wavering yet clinging to a fragile hope. Mary, his mother, her heart wrenched with unbearable sorrow, watched with agonizing intensity, her face a mask of grief. Her silent anguish was palpable, a presence that echoed the suffering of the Son. The journey was not just a physical one. It was a spiritual pilgrimage, a descent into the deepest depths of human suffering. With each labored step, Jesus' physical strength ebbed, replaced by an inner strength, a quiet resilience born of faith and unwavering commitment to his mission. His body was breaking, but his spirit remained unbroken. The pain was intense, excruciating, yet he bore it without complaint, without resentment. His silence a testament to his unwavering devotion. The uneven terrain of the city presented a constant challenge. He stumbled, almost falling several times, the weight of the cross, his exhaustion and the blows from the Roman soldiers all contributing to his increasing fragility. Each fall was a symbolic fall, a representation of humanity's repeated failure and need for grace and redemption. Yet, with each stumble, he rose again, his resolve never faltering, his spirit unyielding. The route itself became a symbol, a painful allegory of the journey of faith, filled with trials, temptations, and betrayals, but ultimately leading to redemption. Jerusalem's streets, normally places of commerce and interaction, transformed into a gruesome stage for a profound drama. The sun beat down mercilessly, adding to their already unbearable suffering. The dust, raised by the throng, choked their lungs, adding to their breathlessness. The physical pain was a constant companion, a relentless reminder of their mortality, yet it served to highlight the spiritual strength that shone through their exhaustion. Women from the city, moved by compassion, approached Jesus, offering him water and wiping away the blood and sweat that streaked his face. Their simple acts of kindness were a counterpoint to the brutality of the crowd, small gestures of compassion in the midst of overwhelming hatred. The physical exhaustion was compounded by an emotional and spiritual weight. Jesus carried not only the cross, but the weight of the world's sins, the burden of a broken humanity, the anticipation of the ultimate sacrifice. The emotional turmoil was as intense as the physical pain, a torrent of anguish that swelled within him, a sea of sorrow that threatened to consume him. Yet, amidst the suffering, he maintained an inner peace, a quiet dignity that shone through his weary body. His gaze remained steadfast, his spirit unwavering. He offered no curses, no recriminations. He simply persevered, bearing his burden with a grace that astonished and confounded those who watched. As they approached Golgotha, the physical burden increased, the final ascent growing steeper, more arduous. The weight of the cross seemed to double, to triple. His breath came in ragged gasps, his legs trembling with exhaustion, his body screaming in protest. Yet, he pushed on, his determination fueled not by defiance, but by a profound love for humanity. The silence around him, broken only by the occasional grunt of exertion or the jeering of the crowd, was somehow more daunting than the noise itself. The approach to Golgotha was a slow, agonizing climb towards the ultimate sacrifice, a journey to the heart of darkness, where darkness itself would be conquered. The road to Calvary was complete. The hill of skulls awaited. The stage was set. The final act was about to begin.